Hello dear chess friend, I'm International Master Ostrovskiy. You're welcome to the second volume of the course dedicated to minor pieces endings. We begin with same colored bishops, and in this lesson we are going to discuss most important theoretic positions. So let's get started. Unlike opposite colored bishops, same colored bishops have the access to each other, which means that the strongest side has a chance to win the position with a single pawn on the board fighting for critical squares. So the critical square here, the most important one, is of course d7, because once the pawn is there, it's not possible to stop it from promotion. At the moment, of course, it's not possible for white to occupy this square because bishop takes this pawn and it's a dead draw. So what we have to do here basically is to force the bishop away from this diagonal, and after that d7 will be possible to do. So usually we have several ideas how to force the bishop away from the critical diagonal. We can deflect this bishop with our own bishop, or we can also close this diagonal. In this particular case, of course, it makes no sense to deflect the bishop because bishop has a lot of squares on this diagonal, and moves like bishop e2 or bishop d1 are not that efficient, so black's bishop will just maneuver on this diagonal a4, e8, and white will make no progress. So the second method, exactly the closing of the diagonal, or occupying this diagonal with the own bishop, should be much better. So which square to choose to occupy diagonal a4, e8 with our bishop? Most likely the c6 is the most efficient one. Why? Because once the bishop is on c6, black has two choices: to take the bishop, which leads to absolutely winning king and pawn ending, or to go away from this diagonal, which leads to d7. That's why white plays bishop f3 here. Black has no satisfactory defense against bishop c6. For example, if king goes to e8 here, getting closer, it doesn't help. After bishop c6 and exchange, white wins in this position after d7. And if the bishop stays on diagonal a4, e8, let's say bishop to e8, then white simply plays bishop c6, intending to exchange bishops and play d7. And if bishop goes away, then white simply plays d7 and wins. So this example is rather simple, but it already shows some typical ideas. So let's have a look at more complicated cases. In this position, white's task is harder because, first of all, the pawn is on the 5th rank, and even if it gets to the 7th rank, the bishop of black will have a chance to stop it controlling the square of promotion. But first of all, of course, white has to make a progress with the pawn and to bring the pawn to the 7th rank. It's not possible to play c6 for the same reason, so bishop simply takes the pawn. So white starts with the typical maneuver. First, bishop goes to c6. So after that, white has a chance to exchange bishops. Of course, it will lead to absolutely winning king and pawn ending, and black's bishop should go away. Since diagonal h1, a8 is no longer possible for black to occupy, the bishop has to find another diagonal to fight with the pawn c5. And this diagonal in this particular case is of course a4, e8. So the bishop has to be ready to occupy one of the squares on this diagonal once the bishop c6 goes away. That's why one of the typical ideas here is to play something like bishop to e2. Now after bishop d5, also very typical thing, now white wants to play c6, the bishop goes to b5, stopping the pawn. Now if bishop goes back to c6, we can notice that white makes no progress, so white should find a better square to fight for this diagonal. So in this particular case, it is a square d7. If the bishop occupies d7 square, this forces the bishop away and white will have the time for playing c6. So bishop goes to e6. Black's bishop doesn't have any other possibility to achieve anything, so it should simply stay here, but simply moving the bishop along diagonal a4, e8 will lose the time because black doesn't achieve anything in addition to what he already achieved. So the best strategy is to try to activate the king because it is far away. So king goes to e3, getting closer to the pawn. And if black's king will have a chance to occupy d4, then it will be very hard for white to make progress, because the king will attack c5 and bishop d7 idea won't work. That's why it is vital to play bishop d7 right now. Now the bishop is forced away, so bishop goes to a6. Now it is the best position, because it is the only diagonal to control the square of the promotion, since h3 c8 is already occupied by white's bishop. So white plays c6, king goes to d4, and c7. So we can notice that white made a great progress here. Now the next stage is to do something with the bishop a6. Pay attention to the diagonal a6 c8. So it is quite short. The bishop has only 3 squares on this diagonal. One of them is already controlled, so basically the bishop has only b7 and a6 at his disposal. So white's task is quite simple here. If white manages to bring the king to b6, attacking the bishop, most likely this will be enough to force the bishop away, in which case it will be possible to promote the pawn. So after king c4, white should perform exactly this maneuver, but immediate king c6, as we may notice, leads nowhere because of black's bishop b5 move. So the king can't go away from the bishop d7 and has to come back to d6 hence, and bishop also comes back to a6, in which case white achieves nothing. So in this situation, white has another interesting method, another interesting idea. White makes a waiting move. So bishop goes to h3 simply. Now the bishop is no longer vulnerable on d7, and white is ready perfectly for this maneuver, king c6 and king b6. At very first glance, it looks like that black has a chance to stop this maneuver by playing, for example, king to b5. In this case, however, bishop goes to f1, which check, and the bishops are being exchanged, which leads to a promotion. So this doesn't work. If king goes to b4 here, intending to occupy a5 square, fighting for at least b6 square, then after king c6, king a5, once again we may notice that black is seriously limited. So bishop can't move. The king is also seriously constrained, so what white needs here is to make a waiting move again. So just bishop g4, for instance, and now if king goes away, then king goes to b6, completing the mission and winning the game. If after bishop g4 black tries another option, it is bishop to b5 check, then white's king gets the access to b7 square, improving the position. So now after bishop a6 and king to a7, black no longer has a chance to move the bishop, and the bishop is under attack, so only sensible black's move here is king to b5. In which case we play bishop e2 check, but black has king to c6, of course not a5 or whatever, because in that case we simply take the bishop, so only king c6 gives black a chance to counterattack the pawn c7, creating the threat of just taking it. Of course we can't take the bishop in this situation, and at first glance black is doing very well, but we have the winning king b8 move. And again, we just exploit the short diagonal. So as we may notice, the king now controls both b7 and c8 squares, at the same time protecting the pawn c7, and the bishop a6 is being deflected. So it's not possible to take on e2. Bishop b7 doesn't give black anything, because we have bishop f3 winning the bishop. So this position is lost. Let's have a look at the other interesting possibility for black. So after the first move, bishop c6, black has the interesting idea to bring the bishop to h3 c8 diagonal immediately. So we saw that actually occupying a4 e8 doesn't really help black, so white is in time to occupy the critical d7 square. What happens if the bishop immediately goes to g4? So now if we play bishop d7, of course the bishop simply comes back to f3 and we make no progress. So white's best plan is of course to bring the pawn up to c7 and to try to win that position. So for this reason bishop goes to d5. Now opponent's bishop has no chance to stop the pawn from moving to c7, and the best strategy is just to activate the king. So king goes to e3, c6, king goes to d4, c7. So in this situation, black's king is much more active than before, and white has to be really careful. So after c7, black starts with the bishop c8 just blockading the pawn, and white has to do something here. If white, for example, occupies diagonal h3 c8 immediately, black will play something like bishop to b7, controlling the square c6, and white will have some problems with converting it. So white's best strategy here is, of course, to bring the bishop to h3 c8 diagonal to force the bishop to b7 or a6 squares, where after it will be possible to perform almost the same like in the main line, so the king to b6, and then trying to do something with that bishop which occupies extremely short diagonal. But as I said before, immediate bishop e6 is not that attractive. So in such a situation, white has an interesting way to wait a bit and to play bishop to f7. So it's important just to bring the bishop somewhere on this diagonal a2 g8. Why it is so great? Because we can notice that the bishop controls c4 square, so this prevents further activation of black's king. And appears that black has some problems with finding a good reply, because if bishop, for example, goes to f5, then we win on the spot with the help of bishop e6, closing diagonal h3 c8 for the bishop. If king goes to e4, let's say, we play bishop e6 here, and the difference, if compared to the immediate bishop e6, is that bishop doesn't have a b7 square, because in this case it leads to this typical deflection, bishop d5, and white wins. Bishop takes bishop c8 queen. So after bishop e6, the bishop has to go to a6, and now nothing can stop us from this king c6 maneuver. King e5, king goes to b6, attacking the bishop. It's obvious if king takes bishop, we take bishop and win the game. And if king goes to d6, after simple bishop h3, let's say, black is in Zugzwang. So the bishop can't save its position along diagonal a6 c8, and the king can't stay on d6. So once black moves, white wins something. So after bishop f7, probably bishop b7 is the most testing defense, but in this case, again, we just play bishop e6, and black is in kind of Zugzwang. So the king can't go to e4 because of this bishop d5. We already saw this trick. If instead king goes to e3, the king is just going away, and we have this simple king c5 followed by king b6 move. And if finally bishop goes to a6, we start this maneuver. So king c6, king e5, king b6, and it is actually the same. So after king e6, king a6, king d7, and king b7, we win the game. So this example is much more complicated than the previous one. So we saw the same technique of finding critical squares and kicking opponent's bishop away. And also saw an interesting idea of using the short diagonal if it is possible. So in this particular case, the bishop had only 3 squares, and one of them was already controlled, so basically it was about 2 squares. And the idea in such a situation is just to attack the bishop with the king, or controlling the square of the promotion with the king to deflect the bishop with the own bishop. Let's have a look at the other example. Now there is an interesting question. Is it really possible to save the position of this type? Of course, the best strategy for the defending side is to blockade the passed pawn with the king safely, but what if you don't have the access to such a square? Just like in this position, black's king doesn't have a chance to occupy d8, let's say, which would have been, of course, a dead draw. Well, the best strategy in this situation is, of course, to control the ideal square with both the bishop and the king, and also to have the access to this passed pawn. Just like here, so pay attention to black's king's position. So it attacks the pawn d6, but what is really important, the king also takes part in controlling c6 square in addition to the bishop. So in fact, this c6 is the ideal square in this situation, and it's not possible to occupy it with the bishop. So This means the strongest side has to occupy d7 square to kick the bishop away from diagonal a4 e8, and this blockades the own pawn. So let's have a look how this works. So bishop goes to g4. Now black has to actually maneuver the bishop along diagonal a4 e8 because the king occupied the ideal position. So bishop a4. Now bishop goes to d7, and if compared to the ideal c6 square, in this case, once the bishop goes away from a4, white doesn't have a chance to play d7. And this gives black just enough time to maneuver the bishop to the other diagonal. So bishop goes to d1, now bishop goes to c6, and now bishop goes to g4, just in time to stop d6, d7. So this is exactly the defending technique here. So bishop should be in time to control the critical square. In this particular case, it is d7, occupying diagonal a4 e8 or h3 c8. And the position of black's king makes this plan possible. So bishop d7, bishop d1, bishop f5, bishop a4. As you can see, white can't make progress. So without bishop c6, it's not possible to actually win the time to play d7. So bishop d7, bishop d1, bishop c6, bishop g4. Now, for example, white is waiting here, bishop b7. Alright, it is possible just to play bishop to h3. If the pawn d6 is not attacked by the king, c5, it is possible to play bishop to c8. Here, bishop c8 leads to just exchange of bishops, and the king just takes the pawn on d6. By the way, after bishop h3 and, for example, bishop g2, it's just good enough to stay with the bishop on this diagonal, but you should also know another interesting possibility. So even c8 square is possible for the defending side to occupy, because bishop is invulnerable here. If king takes, then king takes d6, and it is a draw. You should know that this defending technique doesn't work in each and every case. One of the most important exceptions you can see on the board. So white has the knight's pawn on the 7th rank already and wins this position, although black controls the ideal square with both the king and the bishop. c7 is not possible to occupy, which makes b8 square another target for white's bishop, because it is basically the only way to kick black's bishop away from diagonal. So bishop goes to h4, and white starts the maneuver. So bishop wants to get to b8 gradually. And black has to be fast enough to prevent it, because if black simply plays something like bishop f4, then after bishop f2, let's say bishop a7 and bishop b8, white wins, because after bishop f2, bishop somewhere along diagonal h2, b8, and bishop a7, this second diagonal appears too short, and it is really simple to deflect the bishop with the help of bishop g1. That is the main reason why this technique doesn't give black a draw in this situation. So the second diagonal is really short, and just add one more square to this diagonal, black would be alright. But in this particular case, there are only two squares, and now the bishop has no chance to save its position on diagonal a7, b8. White wins. So after bishop h4, black's best technique is to control a7, so king goes to b5, and after bishop f2, king goes to a6, preventing the maneuver of the bishop to b8. And now, for example, if bishop goes to e3, black plays bishop d6, bishop g5, king goes back to b5, bishop d8, king c6, we can see that black is just okay. So instead of that, bishop goes to c5. That is the key move that actually wins here. So what is going on here? After bishop f4, bishop to e7, king to b5, and bishop to d8, there is a threat of bishop c7, which forces black to play king to c6. And now bishop goes to g5. So white starts the maneuver to a7, winning a tempo, which is of course decisive. So after bishop h2, bishop goes to e3, and black no longer has a chance to prevent this bishop a7, bishop b8, which wins just like we saw in the main line. So That is the point here. So why exactly to c5? Because if bishop goes anywhere else after bishop d6 and this maneuver, the same idea, I mean bishop e7 doesn't give white anything because bishop simply goes away to h2, where it is not accessible for white's bishop, and as you can see, king controls c5 square. So it was really important to prevent bishop to d6, and this wins. In my opinion, it is very instructive and very important example that you should simply learn by heart.